Sorry. Yes. To it, welcome to this PhD defense by Mr. Leandro Lind, entitled TSO-DSO Coordination, a multidimensional study on coordination schemes, modeling and regulation in the European context, supervised by professors Dr. Rafael Cosentarin and Dr. Pablo Frias Marin. Now the secretary is going to read the norms that exist for this PhD presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rafa. So I will read a translation of the excerpt from the norm of doctoral regulation. So today we will have the evaluation and defense of the doctoral thesis of Leandro Lind, and this will be in compliance with the Real Decree 576 of 2023 of July 4, which modifies the Real Decree 99 of 2011 of January 28. Article 14.4. The doctoral thesis will be evaluated during the defense event, which will take place in a public session and will consist of the presentation and defense by the doctoral candidate of the research work prepared before the members of the tribunals. The doctor present at the public session may ask a question at the time and in the manner indicated by the president of the tribunal. Article 14.7. The tribunal will issue a report and the overall grade awarded to the thesis according to the following scale: not acceptable, pass, notable, and outstanding. The tribunal may propose that the thesis be awarded the distinction of cum laude if such distinction is unanimously granted by a secret vote. The university will enable the necessary mechanism for the final awarding of this distinction, ensuring that the vote count for this award is carried out in a session different from that of the defense of the doctoral thesis. Then we have the extraordinary doctorate award that is from the doctoral regulation of the Pontifical University, the Comillas Pontifical University. Article 23.1. The annual extraordinary doctorate award may be granted to those theses that are particularly meritorious and that have been obtained with the highest grade, with a proposal of one extraordinary award for every 10 doctoral theses defended per program. If the minimum number of 10 theses is not reached in an academic year, the candidate thesis will be accumulated for the following year. Article 23.2. After the defense of each doctoral thesis, each member of the tribunal will be asked for their opinion on whether the thesis should be eligible for the award in question, as well as an evaluation of it according to the rubric established by each program. Each member will submit their opinion in a sealed envelope unanimously and confidentially. The secretary of the tribunal will collect the envelopes and forward them to the International Doctoral School. The academic committees of the programs will prepare the necessary rubrics to evaluate the candidate doctoral thesis. Article 23.3, this is the last one. The General Doctoral Commission, in an ordinary session and in a view of the opinions collected from the different members of the thesis tribunals and the reasoned reports of the various academic commission, will award the extraordinary doctoral awards to the best doctoral thesis defended during the academic year in the program. This distinction will be reflected as a note on the back of the student's diploma.
Thank you very much. So now what we'll do is that the PhD defendant will present the thesis, and then we'll sit down there for attendance. After that, we will start the questions turn. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Is this working? Great. Okay, so I have 1 hour, right? Yeah. Okay. So thank you everybody for coming to this PhD defense. It's titled TSO-DSO Coordination, Multidimensional Study on Coordination Schemes, Modeling, and Regulation in the European Context. It was supervised by Dr. Rafael Cosent, Dr. Pablo Frias. Thank you already for everything during these long 6 years. First of all, I would like to explain a little bit what I mean by this TSO-DSO coordination, okay? So here we have an illustration of a cross-section, let's say, of typical power system, okay? So we have generation, bulk generation on one side, customers on the other side, and in the middle, we have these two actors, TSOs and DSOs, transmission system operators and distribution system operators. But to tell the truth, this cross-section is changing very rapidly, okay? So something that has already changed is the deployment of renewables on the bulk side of the generation of power systems. And on the customer side, we also have distributed generation being deployed. We have storage, we have electric vehicles, and all these new elements being deployed to power systems, they are posing both challenges and opportunities for these actors here in the middle, for TSOs and DSOs. So to mention a few, for TSOs, for instance, they might see more variability in the generation coming from bulk generation because of these non-controllable units here. And from the DSO side, they might see a higher load, for instance, because we have new elements being connected. These are the challenges, but especially these elements here, they also pose an opportunity for these two system operators because they can also be flexibility providers. So in this new situation in where we have more variable generation and higher loads, flexibility can help system operators to manage their grids in a more efficient way. So now comes the topic of this thesis. How can these two system operators coordinate themselves to procure efficiently this flexibility from from distributed energy resources, as we say in the thesis? This is the main topic of this thesis, okay? So we start with chapter 1. The structure of the thesis also, the structure of the presentation also coincides with the structure of the thesis. So chapter 1, we have introduction, motivation, research objectives. And here I would like to highlight the objectives of this thesis. So the first one is to identify efficient coordination schemes for TSO and DSOs in the European context. We focus here on coordination schemes for congestion management and balancing services. Okay, because these are considered the most important ones, at least at the beginning of this enhanced coordination. The sub-objectives, we want to provide concrete coordination schemes for balancing and congestion management. We want to develop or adapt optimization models to test these coordination schemes. And we want to evaluate as well regulatory conditions for this flexibility procurement in Europe. Okay? So this is the map of the thesis. We started already in chapter 1 with the background, motivation, objectives, and the thesis outline. We'll move on to chapter 2, in which we'll have a literature review and also an assessment of TSO-DSO coordination landscape in Europe. And this chapter 2 will inform the rest of the thesis that will develop 3 content chapters, so to say. So we have them also divided here in 3 research domains. So the first one is an applied quantitative research. We will model coordination schemes, and we will have case studies for 2 countries, realistic case studies, in which we will have also modeling for 1 year, Sweden and Spain. Then we go on to a more theoretical quantitative research in which we'll dive a little bit deeper into game theoretical aspects of some of these coordination schemes. And finally, we'll have a qualitative chapter in which we will analyze both business models for the development of TSO-DSO coordination, as well as regulatory conditions in Europe for this coordination to take place. And we'll finish with chapter 6, summary, conclusions, future work, and original contributions. So this is the list of chapters that we have here that also coincides here with the list on the left side that you can follow along. So we'll start with chapter 2 now, that is based on a paper published back in 2019 in Wiley Interdisciplinary Reviews. And that is the state of the art, but also an assessment of TSO-DSO landscape in Europe. So the first thing here to mention is that although TSOs and DSOs, they might have similar objectives, operating networks and maintaining the security of supply, here we see that they have actually very different characteristics. So transmission networks, it is a meshed infrastructure. It is almost always operated as a meshed, with a mesh topology. We have low number of consumers and generators connected to those grids, and we have a high monitoring degree. Distribution network, and here I already point to the fact that in Europe, most DSOs, they also operate the high voltage grids. We still have meshed and topology, but then as we go down on the voltage levels, we see more of a radio operation, a higher number of actors connected to that network, and a lower monitoring degree. And this will be important later when we formulate the models for TSO-DSO coordination. Another point to highlight is that the DSO landscape varies greatly in Europe. So we have some countries, the typical example in Germany, in which we have 800 DSOs, and in some countries, Greece or Ireland, we might have just 1 or 2. So, and also we have some countries here that they have several layers of DSOs. So we might have one TSO, one regional DSO, one local DSO. So not heterogeneous, not homogeneous landscape for DSOs in Europe also is important for us to consider on later chapters. And here we have the coordination schemes. Here we have a summary of that we do, gathering what we learned from the literature, and we group them into these 3 main coordination schemes. But before diving into this table of advantages and disadvantages, just a quick illustrative intuition of what they are. So a common coordination scheme, as I was mentioning, how will TSOs and DSOs procure flexibility from distributed energy resources? The common coordination scheme is very simple. So these network system operators, they have some issue over voltage, over loads or voltage issues. They want to procure flexibility. So in a common coordination scheme, we'll have a joint TSO-DSO market, so a single marketplace, okay? So these system operators, they will place their needs, and the flexibility providers, both at distribution grid and at transmission grid, they will also place their bids here, and we'll have one single market clearing, okay? A multi-level coordination scheme is a hierarchical or a sequential coordination scheme in which, in this example, first we'll have a DSO market. So first the DSO will clear their market, solving their needs. And after that, we have a TSO market in which unused bids from the DSO market are passed on to the TSO market, okay? And then we have the bidding as well and the needs from the TSO side. Finally, a fragmented coordination scheme, we would have, similarly to the multi-level, a DSO market, a TSO market, but these markets are independent, let's say. So we have here the DSO solving their network problems with only the distributed energy resources at the distribution side, and here the TSO only with resources at the transmission side. And an important aspect in this coordination scheme, the typical formulation, is that the power flow is maintained at the interface. This power flow, let's say, from a day-ahead clearing. So we have here a forecast, and the system operators would have to maintain that forecast. So now we can look a little bit at the advantages and disadvantages of these coordination schemes. A common coordination scheme will lead, and this is found in the literature and also confirmed later on the thesis, that will lead to the least cost of procurement. And this is even intuitive because we have one optimization problem. All constraints are considered at the same time. But we have here a large market clearing problem, and also we have to share network information, and this might be a problem. Here we have two flavors. We can also have this common coordination scheme in the distributed way. So using the composition techniques, for instance, for an optimization problem, in which we can separate TSO and DSO problems, but still have only a single optimization problem. I'll go a little bit more in detail later. Here we have the disadvantage of having complex real-time information exchange. In a multi-level, we don't have network sharing. We don't have the data from the network being shared, but we have rather complex, let's say, validation from the DSO side that will have to validate as well which unused bits can be sent to the TSO so that problems are not created by the second market. And also we can expect that this will decrease a little bit the efficiency. So because here we have two separate optimization problems, okay? And the fragmented one is the simplest one to implement, let's say. There is no sharing of information, but here also the TSOs, the efficiency loss can be even higher because the TSOs and DSOs, they cannot share resources connected to each grid. Okay, so a few conclusions that we found in this chapter. First, that the coordination, there was a lot of research already in coordination schemes for TSO, DSO, as we showed in that summary, but there was still an opportunity to research some aspects such as the interface flow pricing at the fragmented coordination scheme, as we'll explore later. The optimization models, there is still room for improvement in optimization models for TSO-DSO coordination, especially when talking about mesh-to-mesh networks. Most papers in the literature, they were theoretical in the sense that they consider a test case for transmission grids that is a meshed grid, and then radio grids simulating a medium voltage or low voltage grid. But in fact, we see in this chapter that most coordination will take place at the extra high voltage to the high voltage interface. Finally, here we have also data management and exchange. This is something that is a bit outside the scope of this thesis, but there's still room for research in this area. And we also see that the integration of distributed energy resources in existing markets is still a bit not completed. Now we move on to chapter 3, that we start modeling TSO-DSO coordination schemes. So this chapter is based on a paper published back in 2023 in Sagan. So here, what we want to do to start modeling this coordination is to have the modeling of a complete market sequence for Europe. Okay, so we have this typical market sequence that will have first a wholesale energy market, so a day-ahead market. After that, we'll have a congestion management market, both for the TSO, which already take place in some countries, and for the DSO that we expect to take place, and balancing markets. So as we know, day-ahead markets in Europe, if we are not talking cross-bidding zone, they do not consider the network. They are a copper plate. So there is the need to check the feasibility of those results, and that's what's taking place here. And then we have the balancing market close to real time. And here at boxes 2 and 3 is where we are going to model the different coordination schemes. Here, in this paper, we model the common and the multi-level, okay? And we model the common and multi-level into flavors. We can consider that the TSOs, they will optimize balancing and congestion management together or sequentially in separate markets, okay? So we model these two options as well. These models are mixed integer programs, and they are implemented in GUMPs. Here's the formulation for the common coordination scheme. Of course, I will not go into the details, but it's just to show you which blocks of equations are doing what. So we have here an objective function that is optimizing not only the flexibility cost, but also the cost of non-served flexibility. And this is a new concept that we introduced in this thesis. That means when a system operator wants to procure or needs to procure flexibility, but that market can simply not supply that, either because the liquidity is low or because there is some network constraints. We use here in this chapter DCOPF because we are talking about mesh-to-mesh networks, and also the voltage levels they allow us to use DCOPF here. We have the modeling of demand response, flexible loads, the renewables. We have the modeling of batteries because in one case study we did have a large battery connected to the distribution grid. And we have intertemporal constraints because this model is a 24-hour model, and then we extrapolate that with representative days to have the results for 1 year. Here's the Swedish case study. We take a grid that is a representative grid of the Swedish transmission network, and we connect to that grid a sub-transmission network that was provided by a DSO. So this work was done in the context of a European project. So we were able to get this almost real data for that sub-transmission network. We gather data from the TSO, the Swedish TSO, and we assemble using a clustering technique. We assemble a case study having 1 year of data, and we compare the results of our model the day ahead with the actual generation in Sweden for 2020. So here are a few of the results from the Swedish case study. Here we are already looking at the different coordination schemes, and we model multi-level in two different ways here. We model a multi-level with an OPF, a complete OPF, and then we have this power transfer distribution factor-based one in which it replicates what they actually did in that demonstration, in that project in Sweden, that is to have the PTDFs at the substation, because that's where they had problems. And here, one interesting thing to note is that here in the no flexibility scenario, so having no flexibility providers at the DSO network, the DSO already has the need or already has a cost here of a congestion, because in Sweden they have what are called the subscription penalties. So the TSO puts a cap, a financial cap that, well, actually a power flow cap, that if the DSO surpasses that, they have to pay a penalty. They potentially have to pay a penalty to the TSO. And by having the flexibility from that was based on this demonstration, we can demonstrate how this can benefit the DSO in reducing these penalties. And these numbers are also later compared with the actual numbers from the demonstration, and they are they match. So here we have, in terms of energy, well, in Sweden, this flexibility is needed in winter and not in other moments of the year. And what we do as well is to have sensitivity analysis on these results. So we take the no flexibility scenario, we take the base case scenario, and we scale up the availability of FSPs for that DSO, and also the beads that these FSPs are providing. So here we can see that it increasing 60%. So here we are going from 1 to 1.6. We can already eliminate the risk of that DSO having those subscription penalties. We also do another type of sensitivity in which we are looking here not at the price anymore, but at the demand. And what we want to show with this exercise is to see if the DSO can incorporate more demand to their grids without having to reinforce that grid, just by using flexibility. And here we show that by having an extra, let's say, 10 gigawatt hour of flexibility activated, that DSO would be able to incorporate 145 gigawatt hour of demand to that grid, and this is about 10% of the demand of that sub-transmission grid. Now we move on to the Spanish case study. We have here, we use a fairly simple network for the Spanish transmission grid, 11 nodes, and then we connect two sub-transmission grids, one from Cadiz that was also provided by the DSO participating in the project, and one in Albacete that we reproduce. Here, the results from the Spanish case study. Right now, there is no need for flexibility for those DSOs because there is no such thing as subscription penalties in Spain, and because the grids are not constrained. But then we do that same exercise, scaling up some parameters, and we see that by scaling up the sizes of FSPs here, the cost actually goes up. And the reason for that is that the FSPs in Spain were mostly renewables. So as we model the complete market sequence, we also see that there is a very important intertwined relationship between being distributed generation and being flexibility provider. So in the first place, these FSPs were distributed generation. So they were actually increasing later on the need for flexibility activation as we scale up their deployment. So a few conclusions from this chapter is that from the DSO's perspective, we show how DSOs can benefit from having this flexibility. And in the Swedish case study, we show that by having an extra 60% from the demonstration baseline, they could already eliminate the risk of penalties. We model different variations for local flexibility markets, the DSO markets. So I showed you two, the OPF and the PTDF based, but we also have a third one that is having PTDFs for the whole network, not only for the substation. And we see that by having that, we would have similar results or the same as the OPF, but we would give more transparency to FSPs, which might be something important. We see the complementarity of FSP types, as I was mentioning, considering that, a wind turbine is an FSP, but is also a distributed generator, so they can provide one type of flexibility, while others, flexible load or batteries, they can provide other types of flexibility, and we see a complementarity between these different types of flexibility providers. And we test different coordination schemes, and we confirm as well that the common leads to the least cost of procurement, or at least is the same as other coordination schemes. So now we move on to chapter 4, which is based on a paper recently published in this year in the International Journal of Electrical Power and Energy Systems. And it's a bi-level study on the interface flow pricing. So I just finished the last chapter saying that, well, the common coordination scheme leads to the least cost, the least flexibility procurement cost, right? So why don't we just implement that? Well, as I also mentioned in the chapter 2, there are a few issues, and the first one is data privacy. So all system operators would have to share network information to one single market operator. That could be the TSO, that could be a third-party market operator. So that could be a challenge. One possible solution, well, I also mentioned in chapter 2, decomposition techniques. And here in the thesis, we have an appendix that we show, for instance, how we could use Bender's decomposition to split the problem, the common coordination scheme problem, into two, in which we would have the master problem with the TSO, only considering the transmission constraints, and then the sub-problem with the DSO, only considering the distribution constraints. And then we have here the complicating variable that would be the power flow over the interface substation. And we test this Bender's decomposition with the different case studies that we also used in this chapter 4. And they converge and they give the same result as the common coordination scheme in a single optimization arrangement. So, but okay, so if the composition techniques can be used, are a possible solution, why can't we just implement that either? Well, when we look at the literature from people studying ICT for TSO-DSO coordination, they point that this type of real-time exchange of information is actually one of the most challenging aspects in TSO-DSO coordination. So here we can see that they converge in 20 iterations for a network that is 100 nodes, 102 nodes. So that can scale up to a point that in real systems it would be hard to implement. Another solution that some researchers proposed recently to reach the same common coordination scheme results is to have the variation on the power flow at the interface properly priced. Okay, so reaching the optimal price here at the substation would lead to DSOs or to TSOs to pay to each other, to share resources indirectly in a way that a market setting that is fragmented or multi-level would reach to the same result as the common coordination scheme. Okay, so these researchers, they published this paper proposing that idea, but again, we have another issue here that calculating this optimal price is something not practical. In this paper, they propose first optimizing, having a common coordination scheme to calculate these prices, to then have the fragmented market model, for instance, that is more of to prove this concept, right? So what we are proposing in this chapter is a bi-level model, okay? A bi-level model that will represent a Stackelberg game. A Stackelberg game is when one actor acts first and the others will react to what the first actor, the leading actor here will do. And here we have the TSO setting the prices at the interface. Okay, setting these prices in this setting, in this first modeling approach here, is setting it freely. Okay, I take this moment already to make a parenthesis that although we say here a strategic TSO, we know that this is not in line with the regulation, but we propose this first as first as an investigation environment that we can understand the mechanics behind the behaviors of these system operators in the setting. Okay, so we have here the TSO setting the interface prices, and then the DSO will have their local flexibility markets reacting to those prices, having those prices here as part of their optimization, their objective function. And then we have here for to better represent this market sequence, the TSO as well, following the DSO's market. Okay, a few notes on the implementation. So we used here linked list flow because we are not here. We have a radial network, so that allows us to use a more a better representation of power flows. To implement this, we convert the lower level problems to their Karush-Tucker conditions. The complementarity conditions are linearized with big M. In the end, we are left with one non-linear term, your typical price times quantity, that we linearized by applying strong duality theorem, and we are left with one mixed integer problem that is written in gaps. Okay, so we have two case studies, one very simplified and another one a little bit bigger. This one is that we can almost solve by hand, and we want to understand the mechanics of this problem here. So let's say that this DSO here has a load of 10, but a line that has a capacity of 6. So the only option for this DSO is to activate this flexibility provider number 3, procuring upward flexibility, right? So then this DSO solved the problem that they have with this congestion, but now there is the problem of rebalancing the system or completing the redispatch. So in a typical fragmented coordination scheme, the DSO would be required to activate those 4 downward megawatts from FSPs 1 and 2. Okay, because they have here exactly 2 in this example. They are providing to us as bits. okay? But maybe this is not the most efficient way. Maybe the TSO could also complete the redispatch here with their FSPs, and maybe that would be more economical. And what we want to understand here is, okay, what is the interface price that would lead to the optimum for the system? And by solving a common coordination scheme, we see that the optimum price is this 18.53. But in fact, here we see that from an optimization perspective, the prices in between 10 and 30 would lead already to the optimum, right? But what happens in between is that by moving this price from the 1853, we would create some cost allocation distortion. So this 1853 is exactly what the DSO would have to pay to the TSO. So the TSO pays exactly what they would need to pay for those FSPs to solve the DSO problem. Okay. So now we will let the TSO to decide the price that they want to put at the substation freely at this moment. And what we see is that indeed the TSO will put the price at 30, because this is where the TSO here minimizes their total cost. Okay, they extract the highest benefit from this situation. And these areas here are indeed an exchange, cost allocation distortion that the DSO is paying more to the TSO than what they should. We have now a bigger case study, 102 bus case study. Here we have, we use IEEE test cases, and we assemble this case study. And on top of the results that we saw for the small case study, we also do some sensitivities here also at the available flexibility and the prices that these flexibilities they bid in the flexibility markets. So the first thing that we notice already, and here we see this sensitivity exercise, is where the risk is higher in terms of this cost allocation distortion. Okay, and here when we see that the available flexibility to DSOs is lower, is where the TSO will have this. Will make a higher cost allocation distortion. Okay, so here is the highest risk that could, for instance, inform regulation or regulatory supervision could be focused on these situations. Okay, but an important conclusion of this chapter that we observe is that by having this incentive to the TSO, of course, we see here, this is the average of all the cases on those sensitivity analysis. The cost allocation distortion is very high, but the cost for the system, the total cost for procuring that flexibility, when compared to the common coordination scheme, or when compared to the first best here, is actually, they are not that far away. Okay, so here we are looking at the percentage that is how far it is from the first best, how far it is from the common coordination scheme. Okay, so we see these two effects. Well, first, a incentivized TSO leads to cost allocation distortion, but it also leads to a total cost for the system that is rather similar to the first best. And but of course, this situation, and as I already mentioned at the beginning, well, it's not something appropriate to consider purely strategic TSOs. That does not make sense within natural monopoly regulation. So what we do is we introduce here a regulatory mechanism to bound the possibility for the TSOs to set these prices at the interface. Okay, so we are putting bounds on that on each interface power flow price. Okay, and then we compare this with other proposals found in the literature. Okay, so here at the end we have our proposal. And then we have two other proposals that are found in the literature. This is the typical fragmented coordination scheme. This is a midpoint proposal found in the original paper that I showed at the, before. And here we have ours that shows that, well, although we still have some cost allocation distortion, it is much more comparable to other solutions. And the total cost for the system here is lower than the other solutions found in the literature. Okay. We also do sensitivities on the parameters for the cap and floor prices of the power flow interface price. And we see that in some situations, so for you to know, just to mention that the previous results, they were based on 1.5 parameter, but if we go a little bit higher, we see that the total cost for the system goes even lower, even more closer to what a common coordination scheme would be. But of course, at the expense of having a higher and higher cost allocation distortion. Okay, a few conclusions from this chapter. Well, first we propose this bi-level model to understand the dynamics in when we have incentives for these system operators and for testing these regulatory mechanisms when we have prices at the interface power flow. We identify the situations where the risk is higher of cost allocation distortion. And this might be important for regulators, for instance, to focus their regulatory supervision efforts. We identify, and this maybe is the most important one, that while there is cost allocation distortion when there are incentives for the TSO, these incentives also drive the total cost of the system down more comparably to what a common coordination scheme, the results of a common coordination scheme. Okay, we propose a regulatory mechanism which compares favorably against other options. And the last one is also very important, that we show the potential of having this indirect sharing of resources by using price at the interface. So this can be a mechanism that enables a fragmented coordination scheme to be a viable, efficient coordination scheme that does not require the exchange of information on the network. And there is a price signal there that leads the system operators to reach, if not the same as a common coordination scheme, but at least a second best. So now we move on to chapter 5, regulatory aspects for TSO-DSO coordination. This chapter is actually based on a collection of conference papers, journal papers, and also some technical reports. So this chapter is divided into two parts. So the first part, we will look at new business models that are necessary to enable this local flexibility procurement by system operators. And then we have a second part in which we will assess the regulatory conditions for TSO-DSO coordination in selected countries in Europe. So starting by part 1, we have here an illustration of what could be this new business model for a DSO. Okay, so business model here is understood as a typical typical concept of generating new revenues for an actor, but also in the case of natural monopolies, to reduce their cost. And here we see, and this is a bit an attempt to illustrate what is in the European regulation, in the clean energy package, that by reducing the capex and increasing a little bit the opex, DSOs could reach to an overall lower cost. Okay. And this is what we understand as a business model for the DSO procuring local flexibility. This is one of the business models that we consider. We also consider new business models for data service providers that will provide services based on data for flexibility procurement and provision. We have independent aggregators, which is already a very consolidated concept, the European regulation, and of course for consumers. Consumers will provide flexibility and will have revenues from participating in those flexibility markets. So to assess these business models, we do a stakeholder consultation. We talk to 31 professionals in 4 countries, Portugal, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden. And we talk with several types of stakeholders. We talk with consumers, industrial consumers, consumers associations. We talk with system operators, DSOs, TSOs. We talk with aggregators, retailers, regulators, and policymakers. And then we are able to list different drivers and barriers for these business models. So I'll not go into all of them. I'll just illustrate with the DSO business model that I showed before, that we have here, well, all DSOs, they understand that this is very relevant for DSOs now and in the future, but both DSOs and regulators, for instance, they understand that there is still a lack of economic incentives and financial compensation. So I just mentioned before with that chart that by reducing CAPEX and increasing a little bit of OPEX, that would make sense for the overall cost. But in fact, what we have in the typical RPI minus X regulation today is that DSOs are actually incentivized to have a higher CAPEX because they are remunerated on that, and to have a lower OPEX because that's what our RPI minus X is doing. So here we have a very CAPEX biased incentive regulation for DSOs. So this is one example of one regulatory barrier. We have barriers that are not regulatory but are technological, and we also have barriers that are organizational because the system operators or other stakeholders, they might have some resistance to some of these new business models and changes. Now moving on to the second part, in which we will dive a little bit deeper into these regulatory conditions or these regulatory barriers for TSO-DSO coordination. And we will do it so by looking at here the coordination schemes that I was mentioning, and we have 2 extra here. That is just a local flexibility market for the DSO only, and a central for the TSO only. So we look also separately for these 2 system operators, and the services that we have: balancing, congestion management, and we also include, because this also comes from a project, voltage control and control islanding, when the DSO, for instance, has to disconnect a part of the grid. And then in bold here, we have the use cases. That's the name we do for these pairs of coordination schemes and services. We have the use cases that we are analyzing. We analyze by having a list of guiding questions. We will do some desk research. We also had some questionnaires answered by stakeholders in the different countries, and we will have a rating criteria. So 0 for when the regulations explicitly prohibit something. So I don't know, distributed energy resources are not allowed to provide voltage control to the TSO. That is a 0, and a 5 when regulation not only acknowledges that, not only allows that, but provides the necessary framework for that to happen. So independent aggregators in Belgium, they are allowed, and we have here a framework of transfer of energy that will allow for BSPs and independent aggregators to settle differences that might arise in that having that flexibility procurement. So this would be a 5. Okay. Here, an example to show you also the list of the countries, the 8 countries that we analyze. And in these tables, we have here a summary of the rationale behind this assessment. Of course, this assessment, although we put numbers here, this is a qualitative assessment. And a parenthesis here is that, well, first, these things are changing and are changing rapidly. So the situation in different countries might have changed a little bit from when we finished this chapter. But what we want to achieve is to have a an illustration and an idea of how implementable a certain use case, a certain pair of service and coordination scheme is in these different countries, in these 8 different countries. Okay, so we compute this index, and then we show here in this illustration still a qualitative exercise, but with this numerical illustration, where and which use cases would be more implementable, let's say. So we see that here, when we are talking about markets that already exist, that are already consolidated, and of course, in situations in which TSO-DSO coordination is not that demanding. For instance, here we are only talking about the TSO accessing distributed energy resources. That is more implementable. But when we talk about coordination schemes that require higher coordination and products that are not as harmonized, then we have a lower implementability index. And here is important to mention as well that, for instance, we talk a lot in this thesis in the previous chapters about markets for congestion management, markets for the TSO, for congestion management, but in fact, that is not a reality in most European countries. It's a reality in Spain, for instance, but several other countries, they might use balancing markets or counter trading or other mechanisms to do their congestion management. And this, for instance, is something to consider when designing these coordination schemes. So a few conclusions. We had a stakeholder consultation that allowed us to identify this myriad of concerns about the different flexibility-related business models and why they are not being deployed. And this is important because if we don't have flexibility, local flexibility provision, and these business models are not in place, then TSO-DSO coordination is also something, this type of enhanced TSO-DSO coordination is also jeopardized. We have here the opening of existing distributed flexibility markets. So for instance, balancing would be something that is more, it's easier to implement. And also market models that does not require higher TSO-DSO coordination would be easier to implement. And what I just mentioned, when we are talking about intra-bidding zone congestion management, we see in the different countries a very unharmonized and often non-transparent, I would say, practices in Europe. So now we move on to the last chapter, chapter 6, conclusions, contributions, future research. So here I'll just mention a few overarching conclusions as we already went through the conclusions from each chapter. The first one, European countries are still lagging on establishing the necessary regulatory frameworks for distributed energy resource integration. It is true that this is changing and it's changing rapidly. We have, for instance, the demand response network code being prepared now, but the countries are still lagging on establishing the necessary frameworks. There's not a single best coordination scheme to try to answer the questions and the objectives from the beginning. In the same way that there is not a single TSO-DSO problem. The landscape, especially for DSOs, varies a lot in Europe. So we cannot set a single best coordination scheme. In this thesis, we focused on 3. We focused on common, multi-level, and fragmented. We modeled them in different ways, and we explored different aspects of these coordination schemes. And we saw that we confirmed the common leads to the least cost of procurement, but it's hard to implement. And finally, with a more theoretical approach, we start advocating, well, we saw that pricing mechanisms at the interface could be an efficient way of achieving this coordination without needing the exchange of information on networks, and could be a second best to a common coordination scheme. Future research. So when modeling TSO-DSO, realistic case studies, one challenge is, of course, because we modeled a transmission grid and one subtransmission grid. But of course, to have numbers for a whole system or a whole area, we would have to model, let's say, all the subtransmissions of that system or country. The bi-level model proposed here could be used in realistic case studies. So using the model from chapter 4 into case studies of chapter 3, for instance. And with regards to the business models and to the stakeholder consultation and the regulatory assessment, we could have it done it more times, so we can not only have a picture of what are the conditions and what are the barriers, but we can have an idea of this evolution through time. Original contributions. So we model and test different coordination schemes and different market designs for local flexibility markets using OPFs, using PTDFs. We implement this mesh-to-mesh topology. That was something that was not found in the literature. We also introduced this concept of non-served flexibility, which might be important when assessing flexibility needs. We developed this bi-level model to study this interface flow pricing mechanics. And we also, well, by the way, this bi-level model is publicly available. It's open source. We propose a regulatory mechanism to combat any potential strategic behaviors in the setting that we propose in the Stackelberg game. And we carry on a survey with multiple stakeholders in Europe. And we also develop this regulatory comparison methodology that could be applied to other topics as well. List of publications. Most of the journal papers were already mentioned. They form the basis for this thesis, the conference papers as well. And here to mention that on the technical reports, some of them are part of this the body of this thesis directly, such as in chapter 3, in chapter 5, but all the others, they also contributed indirectly for this thesis, as they are all related to distributed energy resources, providing flexibility to DSOs, to TSOs, and their coordination. And with that, I can only thank you, and we can move on to the next steps of this defense. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now it's the turn for the members of the committee to ask questions about the thesis. The first should be Dr. Matteo Tronci from Universidad Pontificia Comillas.
Very much. Thank you very much, Leandro, for presenting this thesis. And well, I first make some comment about the things that I like more, because I think that your contribution you have a lot of contribution, and all those contributions are very relevant. And it is also a topic that is very important, in the European framework, because, you have been very active in European projects, and still there are calls for European projects that concern the topic of TSO-DSO coordination. And your thesis is very clear, well focused. The research objectives are also well identified, and all the steps that you have carried out to address the studies are very sound and of great interest. And also the presentation of today was really clear. And I think that I mean also this picture, I liked a lot this structure picture, because it's a kind of you have all the different layers that have been analyzed, that are displayed, and if a new researcher wants to start working on this topic, can start from this picture and check where to check. And also thank you for making your model open access, because this is also important for all the community to have the possibility to build on the shoulder of other researchers that already addressed the topics. And so I have a couple of curiosities about the I mean the coordination scheme analysis and the proposal of developing the interface price of the TSO-DSO interface. So if you could please clarify if setting this interface price also embed the technical capability of the networks, because sometimes in TSO-DSO coordination discussion, there is the point of like prequalification and limiting flexibility activation from TSO or DSO side in order to avoid problems. So is setting the interface price like a way of also providing this kind of tunnel of warranty for activation?
Yes, yes, I can comment on that. Thank you, Dr. Matteo, for the question. Yes, because when in the setting that we have, in the bi-level model that we have, the TSO that is setting these prices at the interface, they of course they are considering first their power flow to set these prices. So when we had that example, that simplified example, an 18.53, that already considers the power flow. And of course, we are assuming this is a Stackelberg game, so we assume here that the TSO has also knowledge about the behavior of the DSO network. So they might not have the network information, but it's a Stackelberg game here is a one-shot game, but we can assume that this learning comes from iterative process of several flexibility markets. So if we assume that this flexibility needs from the DSO side, they do not change a lot from one day to the other, then yes, these constraints, they are considered implicitly in this price at the substation.
Thank you. And this is true, I mean, in both cases in which is the TSO activating a flexibility service provider, and also the case of DSOs.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And another clarification is about well, you have addressed a business model analysis and also stakeholder consultation for about TSO-DSO coordination. And what about, I mean, the acceptability? I mean, if you have an idea of the acceptability of such a solution from stakeholders, and I mean, how do you see from the regulatory perspective the applicability of this solution? So how is it really possible to have it in reality, and are the stakeholders willing to adopt it?
Right. Yeah, I'll stand up so I can see better. Yeah, one thing that I didn't have the time to explore in the presentation, but that we explored in the thesis and in the paper, is we go on and we also develop a little policy discussion on that, because I said, well, acceptability is something super important. If we just say that, well, we have a strategic TSO, that is not something acceptable to start with. But what we show in the thesis is that by having first a regulatory mechanism that puts bounds, and that so we set this in a way that we don't have a strategic TSO anymore, we have an incentive-driven TSO. And dedicated incentives are something that are part of the regulatory frameworks for system operators already for a long time. So TSOs and DSOs, they do act based on incentives for several different things. So with an RPI minus X, they have this global incentive to reduce OPEX, but they might also have dedicated incentives, DSOs, to reduce losses, or TSOs to have meshed offshore grids. And one discussion that we also bring with this thesis is that by having well, first of all, a coordination scheme coordinating TSO, DSO is also a service to the system. So, and this is something that is often not considered in other researches. We have, and we are careful in this thesis to not mention an efficient coordination scheme. We try always to refer to as a least the one that leads to the least cost of procurement, because an efficient coordination scheme might also have to do with other costs that are not being considered, transaction costs and other costs. And we see that this coordination might also have a cost for the system, and they might be placed onto system operators with an incentive. So that would be a cost that the TSO, that would be an incentive that the TSO would have. And then the DSOs, they would have, a cost allocation distortion that maybe they're paying a little bit more. But also in the clean energy package, we see that DSOs, they should have the compensation for their expenses in using flexibility. So this cost allocation distortion could be offset with other mechanisms that are introduced by regulation. So in this way, I think we could have an acceptable or an implementable framework for this proposal of having prices at the substation, and for the TSO to have some incentive to price these prices at the substation.
Okay. Thank you very much. And well, regarding the cost allocation distortion, I mean, this cost allocation distortion is calculated with respect to the common solution, no? So in reality, we won't have this kind of reference, so we need a kind of an estimation, a solution, something agreed between the parties.
Correct. Correct.
Okay. Yes, and well, so it is for further research. I see, and it's okay. And but with respect to, I mean, still this this proposal clearly provides incentive for network investment in a cost reflective way. I mean, still we preserve the fact that the incentives, I mean, the signal to incentives are correctly provided.
Yeah. So one thing that is a bit outside the scope of this thesis is, of course, the planning, the TSO DSO coordination that will have to take place for the planning of the expansion of the system. But by having an efficient price at the substation, you are giving an appropriate price signal to the different system operators of how much that flexibility would cost to them. So assuming, of course, that we offset potential cost allocation distortions, then we have this price signal for the system operators. And then this will be an input for their network expansion decisions. That, I mean, what we propose here would give an efficient price signal for them to later analyze the needs for expansion of the grid.
Thank you very much. And well, maybe the last question. Have you seen in your simulation of the, because in the second part, I mean, I like a lot that part regarding the interface price model, because I think that it's a good solution to have like the efficiency of a common market model, but using a multi-level one. And I mean, from European project on activity, we see that it's difficult for TSO and DSO to coordinate, share information. So of course they want to, for security reasons, but also complexity reasons, they try to minimize the exchange of information. And so have you observed cases in which we have like implicit contribution? So DSO activation will also mitigate problems at TSO, but those those transfer of, these implicit benefits for TSO are captured by the interface price?
They are captured because in theory, well, imagining that these interface prices, they are exactly what they should be, then we are reaching the same result as the common coordination scheme. So by that, and even if we have cost allocation distortions, as we saw, the total cost is similar to the common coordination scheme. So that means that the dispatch of flexibility is also similar to the common coordination scheme. And the common coordination scheme is the one that will allow for this optimal allocation of the flexibility being dispatched in the system. So if one unit at one DSO might contribute for a problem of the DSO, then in a common coordination scheme, for sure that will be taken into account because you have one optimization, one network to be considered. When we have the fragmented with this pricing mechanism, and this price is optimum or close to the optimum, then we have the same result. So this is being taken into account. And another thing that we saw that is, I didn't mention here, and we briefly mentioned in the thesis, is this indirect sharing of resources. For instance, we saw cases in which we have a TSO, we have no congestion at the TSO, and we have 4 DSOs. And we have one DSO that has one problem, and another DSO that can offer an efficient solution. So we see that this DSO can use the unit at the other DSO to solve their problem. And if this price is optimal, of course, then the cost allocation will be the one that has to be. This DSO will pay to the TSO, that will pay exactly the amount that that DSO needs to activate that unit.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now it's the turn of Dr. Andrés Ramos Galán from Universidad Pontificia Comillas.
Thank you, Javier. First is to congratulate you for the document you have written. It's very clear, it's very nice, and has a lot of graphs, a lot of formulas. So you have worked very hard on providing us to this documentation. Also, I have enjoyed the presentation, very clear, very following exactly the same structure of the document. And finally, congratulate for overwhelming participation in many hundreds of reports. So that seems that you have worked very hard on many different European projects, and therefore you have a lot of contributions beyond the specific contributions, the 4 papers you have presented in this thesis. Given said that, I would like to understand a bit better the famous bi-level model, chapter 4. So I'm going to ask naive questions because I'm not fully aware I don't think that I have fully understood the model or you have developed there. Do you mind to put the graph corresponding to the bi-level model?
Yes, sure.
4 blocks or 3 blocks? 3 blocks.
Yes. See if I can go. I'll go faster than this. Sorry. Chapter 3. There we go.
This one.
Yeah.
Okay. So bi-level means 2.
Yeah.
2 level.
Yeah.
Okay. So, however, I have 3 blocks.
Yes.
And you are formulating so the first level, and then you introduce the Karush-Kanteker conditions of the other 2 levels in the first one, in the upper one.
Yes.
Okay. So, and you have 2 TSOs. You have a TSO on the upper level and another TSO, the same TSO, in the congestion management. And therefore, you have 2 objective functions for the same TSO. How do you can deal with this? So on one hand, you are saying you are maximizing the revenues minus the activation cost, and on the other side, you are minimizing the activation cost. That can introduce some kind of conflict, or because you have 2 TSO for this, 2 objective function for a single TSO.
Okay, so here what we wanted is to represent this market sequence also in the bi-level structure. As far as my studies went, we can have several lower levels. We can have one upper level, but then we can have several lower levels. And that would, we can still convert them to the KKTs and then solve as a single mixed integer program. It is true that we could, for instance, have the lower level of the TSO, the lower level 2, together with the upper level. That would be, we haven't had, I didn't do that test, but mathematically it would be the same. But I put as a second lower level here to represent this market sequence. To be very honest, I started with this formulation. So I like, okay, I think it has to be like this because this is the market structure. And we have one decision that is taken before by the TSO. So then the DSO will react to that. And then in this market sequence, the TSO would be that there is this congestion management market that comes after all the others. So I thought, okay, this has to be represented like that. But it is true that later on, when I started like understanding better the bilevel formulation, I think that could be at the upper level as well. But we did several tests to see if like this formulation is, so we had this price at the interface fixed, so we could see if this modeling would reach the same result as on a non-bilevel formulation, and all the results show that this is an appropriate formulation for this problem.
At least from my point of view, that can be, I understand that if revenues and activation costs for the DSO are separate, you can maximize one and minimize the other. But if there is some kind of interaction between both objective functions, is not the same maximizing the difference between both that minimizing or maximizing one and minimizing the other. So at least theoretically, it can be some problematic question there. That is one question. The other is regarding, can you go to the next slide?
Yes.
The numbers, the slopes and the colors of the slopes.
The colors of the slopes, I think it's chapter 3.
I'm going to ask about the values of the objective functions. Why are so different? One is around 15,000 or something like that, and the other is about 200.
Here?
No. It corresponds to the bilevel.
To the bilevel. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. Oops, sorry. Okay, we'll this one now.
And this slide, so the figure is from the thesis.
Here.
Yeah, these ones.
Okay.
So why the TSO has a huge cost of revenues, and why the TSO has so small revenues? Means that is because of itself the size of the corresponding, let's say, system of or it corresponds to the definition of the objective function, because in one you are maximizing the revenues and you are paying the interface flow or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. No. Here, one first explanation is that, well, we are considering one TSO, so let's say whole Spain, and one DSO subtransmission network. So that is a very, like, then the costs will be different. But also another explanation is that this example is very stylized, is really to understand by hand. And we put here, so this transmission network is a typical transmission network for testing OPFs that comes from PJM, 5 nodes. And this distribution network, I invented it. I made it so that it is illustrative enough that we can understand the mechanics by hand. And then we end up reaching these results. But also it makes sense in the sense that we have one whole TSO and one single line, one single subtransmission grid here.
Okay. The way to compare range variation of this price, interface price, with the optimal one, determined by the common coordination scheme, is that at the end you define a range of what is your proposal. You define a range of variation, plausible range of variation. So from my point of view, the lambda, you are plotting there is just what you will end if you will able to solve the theoretical question either by Lagrangian relaxation times single decomposition. So at the end, you are determining the correct price of this interface, DSO, TSO interface. And your proposal is, I don't want to determine that value, that exact value. I propose you to move in this range. And if I'm not wrong, always the TSO will go to the upper side of this range. So it's just a question of, by regulation, I forbid you to go beyond a certain value of this.
Exactly. If I may comment on that, that's right. So the TSO will always have the incentive to go a little bit to the right here. So we are saying here with the regulation, no, we'll put a cap here for you, okay? You cannot go beyond that. But I still want to preserve the incentive for you to be here at this range of the optimality of the system. That's the idea.
Mention that there is a possibility in the presentation. There's a possibility to extend this bi-level model, let's say, to do practical applications or practical use or the use in real life. Okay, and the question is, I have seen the code, and I need to ask you two questions. One is, all the big M's are either 1 million or 10 million. And the other question is, I also have seen that the optimality relative tolerance is put to 0. Okay, that's fine. But there are many, in theory, there are many lambdas or many binary variables in order to determine which are the constraints that are being active, binding or not. Okay, so how do you plan that can be, let's say, used in real life? How do you think that can be, although working with not the real network, not the real transmission network, not the different 100 distribution DSOs that can be in Spain, how do you think that can be used more practically than in the stylized case on practical applications?
Okay. So my answer to that is, well, this thesis tried to bridge both theory and practice, and this might be very challenging, especially in here at chapter 4, that we did a very theoretical work. So in chapter 3, we did something more applied, and I think it's a little bit easier to derive already mechanisms that are right, that can be implemented right away. Chapter 4, we are at a stage, let's say a maturity level that is more theoretical. So maybe future work would have to be done to bridge this, the theoretical work and the implementation. But what I foresee with this kind of work is that, of course, it's not practical to have a bi-level formulation that the regulators and MSA will run a bi-level model to understand the prices at every substation. What we want to show here is that, well, we understand now the mechanics. That is, the TSO has incentives that can be beneficial, but there is the risk of cost allocation, and we could use prices. So the way I see this moving forward is by having some studies, but still somehow stylized or somehow not representing the whole network, because that would be very challenging indeed. But that could lead to a first attempt of regulatory mechanisms and proposals. Because trying to answer a little bit further on that question, I don't see regulators implementing this right away. Okay, in regulation, you might have a period in which the regulatory frameworks, they are maturing. So we saw that with the deployment of renewables and fitting prices and fitting tariffs, that at the beginning they were very high, and the consumer paid more than they should. But this took the technology to a maturity level. And the parallel that I want to make with this is that maybe first regulators will define, well, there will be one price per substation in a few substations, the most important ones, and we'll test this mechanism. And the bound will be this. And maybe the TSO will have more margin to be strategic, if I may say like that. And maybe the DSOs will have more cost allocation distortions, and then the consumers will pay a little bit more. But this will be a first attempt, and then more sophisticated methods could arise. But yeah, this is the way I see this being implemented in actual regulation.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have no more questions to ask you now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next questions would come from Dr. Clara Sofia Gobella from Inestec. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. So, in the first place, I would like to congratulate you for the work. I think it's very impressive, and not only the document, it's very clear and very well organized, and also it's really impressive your involvement in several projects, and most of them very relevant to this topic and to the definition of local flexibility markets, services, and products. So this is clear from the results you have in terms of publications, in terms of technical reports, and so it's really a very good document for the researchers starting to work, but also the researchers working on these areas, and talking also from my side. In terms of the structure, when reading the document, one of the comments I had is, why did you decided to have chapter 5 in the end and not maybe in the beginning, or complementary to the algorithms? Because in fact, it's such a deep analysis of very relevant topics for the definition of the problem that you address, that in fact, when reading chapter 5, we can come back to your work and understanding also some of the options and some of the roadmap of the work that you choose. So this is one of the general comments, but I clearly understand also why you did. So I have several questions for the chapters. I will try to summarize them. Some of them were already answered. But starting with chapter 2, you talk about gray areas for DSO activities. And you have here too, owning new infrastructure and also for data management. My question is, can you elaborate more a bit how this could impact those coordination mechanisms that you are proposing, in particularly owning infrastructure such as storage and EV?
Yeah, that is a challenging question, because of course we didn't consider DSOs to own infrastructure. For instance, in chapter 3, we did the modeling in which we had a large battery, 20 megawatt hour battery, connected to the DSO. But we already assumed what the clean energy package nudges, at least, that DSOs should not own this type of infrastructure as a general rule. Because of course, then we could see distortions, and that is something that we didn't analyze in the thesis. But of course, if the DSO is operating battery, that will change the dynamic, and that will change the clearing of that flexibility market. So the DSO will have beforehand a flexibility element that they can use. And this is a challenging aspect that is not in the thesis directly, but we see in several researchers, not only owning these assets, but for instance, doing reconfiguration at the network. So other flexibility mechanisms that are in the network.
This actually goes to another question that I have. You propose the penalization of the penalties for the non-served flexibility, right?
Yeah.
How does this somehow also penalize the use of this flexibility from the DSO, and not including storage, but for example, using reconfiguration or the control of other assets to manage congestion, for example?
Yeah, in this concept of the non-served flexibility, of course, we also didn't go into we didn't explore which could be the costs of that, because maybe doing reconfiguration would be a cheaper alternative for the DSO. Maybe using a battery, if they own that asset, maybe also that would be cheaper. What we wanted with that concept was simply to say that the DSO has a flexibility market. We assume that the DSO does not own batteries or these other infrastructures. We are not considering reconfiguration in these cases. In these case studies, we do not consider reconfiguration. So we assume that a non-served flexibility result is one that is more expensive to the DSO, is one that the DSO would either need to of course, without being able, but would need reinforcement at that grid, or would need to curtail some unit. So we are assuming, that's an assumption, that this non-served flexibility would be more costly. But of course, for future work and when connecting these other aspects, if a DSO has or not batteries, if a DSO can or not reconfigure the network, that would add more nuance to that non-served flexibility aspect.
Yeah, this issue of the reconfiguration, I think it's key, because for sure the DSO and the TSO will want to use it before considering flexibility. In terms of you identify it as the active management of the network. Do you really consider this as a need or as a consequence of all the topics that you and the challenges that you identify here for?
Sorry, I think I didn't understand the active management, right, of the grids.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they are both. As I said at the beginning, we have challenges and opportunities. So it is a changing situation for system operators that in the end, the same units, the same distributed energy resources that are being deployed that offer a challenge, they are also an opportunity to solve these grids. And of course, active management especially from the DSO side is something that is also being pushed by regulation. Is something that we see the clean energy package saying that, well, now DSOs, you should look at this situation in which you can defer investments and that you can procure flexibility. So this is something that is being proposed and being pushed in a way by regulation.
Okay, so now going for chapter 3 and for the coordination models. It's really interesting the work that you have done, and also the possibility of modeling the different sequences of the market. One of my question is regarding the distributed energy resources that today are already connected to high voltage or even medium voltage networks and start to be applicable to the secondary reserve and automatic reserve markets. So in the way you model it, this is only considered in the end, but in fact, probably in the capacity market, it will be solved in the day before. So how does this, and also on that constraint that the DSO uses first the flexibility and then will be able to pass it to the transmission, it's not actually coordinated with this idea of those resources participating here. So this is one of the points on how do you address it, or how do you plan to address it in the future? But also regarding this issue of the way these models were defined, assuming that the DSO will first use the flexibility from the distribution network, where in fact we know that probably all the other services for the transmission and for system operation will be more profitable for the distributed energy resources owners. So what do you think about this, and how can we also include this on problem you model?
So although we mentioned that chapter 3, we want to have realistic case studies as best as we can, but of course we also have to do a simplification exercise there. And that's why we try to model this stylized market sequence that we go to the literature, we go to the stakeholders reports, and we see that, okay, having a day ahead and then having congestion management and then having balancing makes sense. But of course, this also carries simplifications. The first simplification is that we are not considering capacity markets, which are very important as well. So that is something that would indeed increase the complexity of the modeling quite a bit. So we are only modeling energy. And the second simplification is indeed the market sequence, that we could have different market sequences. So I know that when they are trying in the project in Sweden, the local flexibility market would come before the day ahead market. So we have other possibilities as well. And these would indeed have to be explored in future work, as well as other services. We considered here congestion management, balancing, but we can also have voltage control, for instance, or other services that were not included.
Thank you. Regarding the flexibility service modeling, you have chosen to model in detail the technologies, right? Even though the flexibility services and products should be agnostic. But from your conclusions, it shows that, in fact, they should not be that agnostic, right? Because in terms of, or at least the way they will be specified, they should consider that the system needs probably an amount of upward and downward flexibility. This is really interesting. My question is regarding your tool. How could you model these services in a more agnostic way? Because in terms of practical implementation, probably it should be how it should be modeled, right? Not in specific technologies, or even when considering to model the full network, will you be able to model every resources?
Yeah, this question is actually very interesting, because I think the way we model in terms of product design and market design, the products, they are the same. They are the same for all the flexibility providers. What we are trying to model there is which flexibility can those flexibility providers provide to that market. So I cannot assume that that a wind farm will be able to provide a lot of upward flexibility, because that is not realistic. Also, we assume that a load, a flexible load, like I'm a residential consumer and I'm providing flexibility. Well, I can provide maybe 4 hours of my day, of my load profile, but I cannot just turn off everything in my house. So we are trying to model what are the capabilities of these FSPs. And then what we see and conclude is that there is complementarity. Well, first, that not every FSP is the same. So I have a wind farm and that's an FSP, and I have a battery that's an FSP. But in the context of a flexibility market, they have different capabilities, and they will reflect those capabilities in their bidding, in their market. So I might have just the same product for every flexibility provider, but they will bid differently. And from a system operator's perspective, that means that, well, the flexibility providers that I have in my grid, they will play an important role in answering, well, can I solve my network problems with those FSPs or not?
Yeah, but when it's okay when you look at a problem in the interface with the TSO, but when you start looking at the distribution level, you will get very different resolution and very different capabilities in terms of FSPs. You can aggregate flexibility until the 100 kilowatts, but then the way they are modeled and the time they can participate will be very small and impossible to model in a full scale model. So when going to the distribution, I think aggregation is key.
Yeah.
The modeling of aggregation and the risk of not complying is something key for this, and that we cannot simply ignore.
So yeah, if I may just comment a little bit more, I think I understand a little bit better your question now. That indeed, I mean, the system operators, they have certain needs, and the way they design these products, maybe if it's just a standard product with not well designed, I may say, then maybe they will not have the capability from those FSPs. And this product design should also take that into account, because it's true that for different system operators, the requirements for their operation of the grid will be different. You mentioned the DSOs. I heard in the stakeholders interviews from the TSOs, for instance, some TSOs saying anything below 1 megawatt for me is noise. So I agree that this should be taken into account when designing these products.
Okay, and so to close my question, so finally, you did not address the topic of the reactive power management, and it's completely comprehensible because of the size of the problem that you already modeled and addressed. But in fact, the management of the reactive power in the interface between the DSO and the TSO is a big issue, and maybe one of the topics that they are addressing now first in terms of coordination. So considering the work that you have done now, what do you think is needed for us to model the reactive power and the voltage support? And also if they should be considered separate or integrated in the same problem.
Okay, that's a challenging question as well that we received from the reviewers of the paper as well. And the answer was, I think we have situations in which probably we can already address voltage issue in some situations. So if we are thinking about a radio network, that active power can't be used to raise the voltage at the end of the feeder, well, that's a situation that might be possible to, with the model as it is, to be used. But then, of course, if we want to introduce a flexibility market for reactive power, that will demand adaptations in the model, especially if we want to consider as well the TSO side, because then I have to mention that if we want to have a reactive power flow, a reactive power flexibility market, that we have the TSO, well, then we cannot use DC OPF anymore for the transmission network. Then we have to resort to some sort of AC relaxation that increases the complexity of the model quite a bit. But and then for the distribution side, we could maybe with lean disk flow already consider a formulation that includes reactive power procurement from the DSO side. But of course, we would always have some imprecision when modeling the interface, because maybe we don't have the reactive power flow from the TSO. We could consider the tap changes at the transformer. But yeah, indeed, it would require a lot of adaptations to the model, especially if we want to consider transmission.
I think particularly focusing on the power flow, reactive power flow in the interface and trying to solve that problem would already be a great contribution. And then the management inside the distribution network would be another step of the way. Thank you, Leon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now is question turn for Dr. Antonello Monti from RWTH Aachen University.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon at this point from my side. First of all, I would like to join the colleagues in congratulating you for the very good work, both on the written part and in the presentation today. I really enjoyed your talk. It was very clear, well structured, and in a certain sense, let me say, easy to follow without that seeming negative, but positive in the sense of their argumentation were very clear and well structured. I have several questions as well. I'll try to get a little bit organized in the questions. I prefer to start with some, let me call them philosophical questions. Do you see, after this analysis and the work you have done, value and need of European harmonization or not in this area? So I think we in Europe are always bouncing back and forth between trying to build European solution and trying to have country-driven solutions. What's your impression on the topic you are addressing, and what will be your recommendation after what you learned?
Thank you, Dr. Antonello. That's indeed a very good question. My answer right away would be no. I don't think the way forward is harmonization, or at least not standardization. Because what we show at chapter 2 is that, well, at least from the DSO side, the landscape is not homogeneous. So then if we are trying to think of a solution that is harmonized for whole Europe, but is applied to a very heterogeneous landscape, then it might be complicated. I think the needs from DSOs in the south of Spain are different, maybe, than the needs from the DSOs in Sweden, as we saw in chapter 3. The characteristics for DSOs, they change quite a lot. So the way I see it moving forward is mostly coordination schemes, of course, being transparent, being market-based, but being defined based on maybe some certain guidelines from a European perspective, but that the member states can still have the member states and system operators can still have some degree of freedom there to establish mechanisms that make more sense for their needs.
Okay. One point was, you had several moments in the presentation, is that, you know, higher coordination was seen as a challenge because of the data exchange. Because data exchange is my bread and butter. I'm really interested in understanding, first of all, is that worth it? So if the question is, it is complicated because the data exchange will be complicated, but if there is a value, I think it is, you know, reasonable to try to solve the problem. But if there is no value, then forget it. How would you position yourself?
Sorry, let me see if I understood it correctly. Well, the data exchange is indeed a barrier that we don't explore all the facets of this problem. Of course, it's a little bit outside the scope of this thesis, but we identify the main challenges, and I think from our research we can point to two. The first one is the legal, so to say, possibility of this data exchange. So is simply having system operators sharing their network data to a centralized party, and that we would have there a practical legal implication on that. And the other one is the technical aspect of data exchange. So we show the decomposition technique that would require real-time data exchange. That would be a technological barrier for that data exchange. So what we try to point with the thesis is that, okay, maybe we can try to find solutions that are second best. Maybe we can find solutions that try to reach optimal situations for TSO-DSO coordination, but that minimize that data exchange. I don't know if I answered your question.
Partly, yes, but the question is, there is a value anyway. If let's suppose we solve the legal and the technical question, we have a value out of this, let me call it intensive data exchange.
Oh yeah, I see now. Yeah, indeed, and this I think is something that, as it was a little bit outside the scope of this thesis, we didn't explore the same way that we didn't explore, for instance, what Dr. Clara asked about all the flexibility mechanisms. So we said in the thesis, well, okay, non-served flexibility will be more costly to the DSOs, but this is an assumption. The same way that we assumed in the thesis that the data exchange is a barrier. We are not considering, which might be true, we are not considering these benefits that might arise from this data exchange.
Yeah, the comment is because I believe that with the effort the Commission is doing now in the terms of data spaces, many of those concerns of the data exchange should disappear. And then the question becomes, do we have to face the cost and complication, and what is the value of that? And because I think the legal terms in that respect are, in my view, solvable with data space, where they were not before. They were not at the time of projects like Coordinate that you were involved. But after the results of the OneNet project, I think this problem can be solved. Okay, this was just general. Another general question is, you had presented different methods. Some were quasi-realistic data, you call them, quasi-real data. You had this expression in slide 22. The question, when we move to a real data scenario, do you see any of these algorithms that have been used collapsing because of scalability issues, or approaching the methods of optimization on a real system, for example, with the solution you propose, doesn't have big limits in terms of scalability? Did you study anyway a little bit about scalability of those methods?
Yeah, we didn't go into the topic of the scalability of the algorithms, but what we do is an assessment that we can foresee already some of the algorithms having this problem. For instance, we identify that this is a common coordination scheme. Okay, we are modeling the whole network for a country or a region, and then we even take some examples from other researchers here from Comillas that they modeled test cases for a whole area in Texas, and then they had more than 1 million buses for that distribution network. So that is an area that we didn't explore numerically or quantitatively, but we identified the thesis that, well, this could be something, this common coordination scheme would definitely face, or we can expect that it will face scalability challenges. And especially if we are considering that we will include more precise power flow algorithms, then the things might have a problem in scalability. In other coordination schemes, they mitigate a little bit this risk. So for instance, having a multi-level coordination scheme or having a fragmented coordination scheme, then from an optimization point of view, you are having each system operator having separate optimization problems. So in a way, we are parallelizing this computation, which could mitigate this risk of scalability.
Thank you. Want to follow up on it somehow. Follow up in a question was what the last one we had from the previous reviewer, and it's about the methods, because in slide 21 and in presenting the optimization problem, you selected to use a DC optimal power flow. First of all, why? Second, would that be a big challenge to move to a complete optimal power flow? Because that could get in the direction of start including reactive power and voltage issues as well embedded in the problem. But if you have an issue right there on the need of using DC OPF, we could have a roadblock, let me say.
Right. Yeah, that is correct. The choice to use DC OPF, especially in chapter 3, well, is because we have a meshed network for TSOs and a meshed network for the DSOs as well. We are considering that the DSO, as in most countries in Europe, is operating the high voltage level. And then having AC OPF with meshed networks, that is challenging. Then we could try to look at other relaxations of the AC problem, but still it is challenged in a mesh-to-mesh configuration. So what we saw is, okay, if we have a radial network, then as we did in chapter 4, we can use some relaxation algorithm that could be appropriate. But because of this mesh-to-mesh configuration, we use the COPF. We also analyzed if that would be appropriate from an error point of view, and we looked at the literature on that, and we considering the voltage levels, and we do this assessment to see if that would be appropriate, and for those voltage levels, it is appropriate. But indeed, if we want to introduce a reactive power flexibility market there, then that would be a challenge. Then we would have to resort to some other algorithm to implement that.
Okay, thank you. I would say last question is exactly on this slide. I still have a point I'm not sure I completely follow, which is this optimal solution, the one without distortion. that's a result you have from your analysis, not something I can, let's say, deduce from the picture itself, right? So there's no information that tells me that's the best point. You have to have that as.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, this is the result of the analysis that we do. And in fact, can you move to the slide that is hidden there, the 40? Okay, yeah, that's one that because of time constraints, I did not present. But here we have this example in which we do the settlement exercise. Okay, so we do the settlement exercise in which we show that the costs for the TSO, here we are only talking costs for the TSO. We have a situation in which we consider no DSO. So we have this bottom line here, 14,811. If we consider this computed price of 1853, then we reach the same bottom line for the TSO, meaning that this constraint from the DSO is not impacting in any way the settlement for the TSO. That's how we conclude that this cost allocation is appropriate.
Okay, very clear, very clear. Good. I'm happy. I mean, many questions been asked before, so I'm happy with my set of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Antonello.
Thank you very much. So now it's my turn. First, congratulate you and your advisors for the work and the document, which is very good. I have several questions. One is related to the strategic TSO.
Yeah.
So you showed that strategic DSO setting the limits can provide the least cost for flexibility procurement, but at the cost of having cost distortion among TSO and DSO.
Correct.
So the question is, if it happened that you may allow this TSO being strategic and according to this regulation, this distortion should not prevent TSOs from using this method or system since they're going to pay an extra cost, although the overall cost is the same. How could you prevent them from not using this type of methodology? That's my first question.
Yeah, I think here what we want to show is that, of course, we model a strategic TSO to understand the dynamics, but we want to make this bridge with not a strategic TSO, but an incentive-driven TSO, a TSO that has the incentives to price the substation correctly, but that limits, of course, strategic capability or this cost allocation distortion. And of course, something that we explore in the policy discussion is that other mechanisms are necessary, regulatory mechanisms to offset, for instance, this cost allocation distortion. So the DSOs, indeed, they will pay a little bit more than what they should if an incentive-driven TSO is in place. But then regulation could also foresee a way to offset this. And the overall cost for the consumer, it is true that it will be slightly higher than our optimum, than our first best. But what we also argue is that, well, first, coordination has a cost that will be somewhere. And in this model, this cost is this incentive for the TSO and the offsetting of the cost allocation distortions for the DSO, and that then it's the challenge for regulators to calibrate that so that this cost is not high to the end consumers. But we show that as this proposal leads to costs that are comparable or that are close to the common coordination scheme, this is expected to be still a good solution.
Okay. Then about information between TSOs and DSOs. So you assume that there are some lines where you have the interface flow between maybe one TSO and several DSOs, because they may be several DSOs. And each one of them has one or more interface lines in which there is flow that initially is unknown. It may be calculated later. Is it that all of them have 100% information about this flow? Meaning what? I'm meaning this thing. You mentioned the word forecasts many times. And let's say I'm going to give you a very simple example. I'm in the TSO, and then I may forecast how much is the flow that, even if I may forecast that, comes from the DSO in my direction. Maybe the flow is in this direction. Could be the opposite. I could forecast the same thing. At the same time, the DSOs, or one of them, that one in particular, does the same calculation and forecasts this thing. So my question is, if this happens and they are not convergent, how this changes, or how this could have an influence on the convergence of the algorithm? Because I'm assuming that these flows that you mention as variables there, they are known. But in fact, they may depend on the other system. And how can you solve it when you solve this model, or these models, because there's more than one? How did you solve it?
Mm-hmm. So here, what we consider, of course, there is a degree of simplification there, but what we are considering is that these initial power flows, so to say, they are not these forecasts that indeed there could be a mismatch of the forecast of the DSO and the forecast of the TSO. And this is especially challenging in chapter 3, in which we have mesh-to-mesh configuration, and then we can have different power flows from different substations. But at chapter 4, as we have it radially, that is a little bit easier to forecast this power flow. And we assume this comes from the day-ahead market. So we have a day-ahead market, and then we have the clearing of that day-ahead market. We place those dispatches for all the units, and we see the overall forecast, the overall power flow of that network. Of course, there we already have a certain degree of simplification, because maybe the TSO will not have the full information of the DSO networks to compute that initial power flow. That is one simplification. And again, this goes into the direction that, well, we have here a Stackelberg game in which the TSO has some information. We assume perfect information in this game, but of course, in practice, we assume that the TSO learns that, or the TSO has some information, because maybe, for instance, that is the observability area of that TSO in the regulation is already. And now with the network codes for demand response, we have also DSOs having observability areas. So there is some information there. But of course, there is an imprecision, because we are assuming, or a simplification, I would say, we are assuming a day-ahead clearing, and with that, a power flow forecast, let's say. But in reality, we could have actual forecasts from TSOs, from DSOs, and there could be a mismatch.
Okay. And related to this, when I look at the problem, then you mentioned, and it's in the model, that you have the interface flows, active power flow, because reactive was not considered, as she mentioned. And you also have, I assume, through this interconnection by this transformer, you will have nodes in which you will have to calculate the demand balance at that node. Interface nodes I'm talking about, not the lines. So according to regulation, I'm not sure, and that's a question I have, that's for my own information. First, in these models where you have not decentralized, you have calculations by the TSO and calculations by the DSO, they are different. Who controls, in terms of who sets the value of the variable, if it's a variable or not, the interface flow, the active interface flow, and the demand balance? Meaning, if you have this transformer, you assume that the balance at that node that serves as interface is done by the transmission or by the distribution? Maybe that's a stupid question, but I've been thinking, I've been looking at your model, and I'm not. Maybe I missed it, and it's explained, but I didn't find it. So I want you to please explain, clarify this.
Yeah, that is actually it's a question that I spent quite some time thinking, and because this is indeed a bit of a choice in the modeling activity, but also that has to reflect with the regulation and the way we do it. We consider the two sides of the transformer of the substation, so to say, one side with the TSO, the other side with the DSO. But it's true that on the power flow equations, this flow, for instance, it stays with, in this case, with the DSO. Why? Because in Sweden, for instance, the DSO was responsible for this power flow at the substation. So they had the subscription values and subscription penalties. So they were looking at the power flow on the substation, so running through the transformers.
And the other question was the demand balance. It's how is it done then?
Yeah, then the demand balance, we would have the demand balance equation for both sides of the substation or transformer. But of course, in these transformers, we would not have load or generation. It would be, I mean, we would have, but we still have the two equations for the two sides.
So each one satisfies the demand. It's on demand.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
And then just a curiosity, also related to the to this by level model, the famous model. You mentioned that in the model, this is a variable optimized in the upper level by the TSO. Optimized in the sense that it maximizes the objective function. And then there is this regulation that makes it bounded because of that distortion that we discussed. And now I have another question on that. What would happen if, according to this demand balance, you use the shadow prices of this demand constraint at that node? Have you tried and see whether this makes a difference? Which means the price is not obtained as a variable, but as a shadow, as a variable coming from the optimization.
Yeah.
Which means that only when you solve the optimization, you are able to get that pseudo price, and that's complicated because you have to solve the problem first and then you calculate that. But you could refit it again and see what would happen if that price happened to be the price that you may use to incentivate providing flexibility by the DSOs to the TSO.
Yeah, in a that's exactly the challenge, because in the end, when we compute this optimum, let's say this 1853, that's exactly the shadow price.
That's the shadow.
That's exactly the shadow price at that substation. Exactly.
So it coincides.
And easy, yeah, it is. It is.
Okay.
So, and then when the TSO is setting that price, of course, the TSO has incentives to set that price, not exactly at that, but close to that. The TSO extracts some benefits if they have incentives to do so, but it's close to this shadow price that is calculated, that would have been calculated with a complete formulation of the model.
So why not using the shadow price to avoid this strategic problem that you may have with the regulator?
Yeah, we are assuming that we don't have one system operator that would have the complete network to solve the problem in the first place. We are assuming this is the problem of, again, sharing network information, that we are assuming the TSO knows, of course, they have their network, they can optimize that. They have some information of the DSOs, but they do not have the complete information. I mean, they cannot solve the whole power flow.
Because I clearly see that shadow price is affected by congestion easily.
Yeah.
That's easy to prove. I mean, not to prove, to see.
Mm-hmm.
But that's hidden if you have this as variable, but I assume it has the same behavior. I mean, if you internalize this congestion, therefore that price that you have as variable has these internal constraints related to congestion, which is passed to the other system.
Exactly.
Okay, now I understand. Okay. Oh yeah, and the final question I have is about the regulation. I have to tell you that I got lost in this chapter because that to me means two things. Means that we don't have a clear regulation in Europe or anything related to this, which I may be wrong. And the second is that if each country does whatever they like and they harmonize it, which is what I always say, what conclusion should we take from that? Is it that from your study and from your you have taken a long time to compare all these regulatory topics, ask people about that, and also create some indexes to see what would happen, even for several countries. Since this is something that I assume should be related to a future European market where, someone in, I don't know, Portugal could send some megawatts to someone in Estonia, let's say, if that market existed. Should European regulators be aware of having a unique and single regulation for this coordination that you mentioned? Because you may assume in the future, you may have let's assume a single TSO for the whole Europe. I mean, this is maybe, you never know. But the fact is that TSOs should always be local because they will always apply local customers. How can these two things could be put together in a single regulation? Should it depend on the country or the market in this case, because markets could involve several countries? Or should we determine by European regulation? Because I think this is somewhat complicated to make both things work at the same time. Mm-hmm. What is your opinion?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and it goes in line a little bit with also what Dr. Antonello asked before. And my answer would be, well, I completely agree that for some services, this is local. So I don't see a provider here in Madrid providing congestion management services for a DSO in Estonia. That would not happen because simply the problems are local. For balancing, that could be possible. That is okay. If we have one single TSO in Europe, maybe that is possible, and there are already these initiatives to have cross-border exchange of balancing beats. But yeah, my view is that from a European perspective, we need guidelines that would give the member states the incentives and the urge to have the appropriate frameworks in place. And these frameworks, they should respect some principles of being market-based, of being transparent, and they should have member states and system operators the accountability to implement those. Because what we saw in chapter 5 and with the stakeholder interviews and then further analysis that we do is that well, these things are very regulation driven. If there is not a regulatory push, then they will not happen for several reasons. Because today DSOs they don't have the incentive to procure flexibility in the first place. So they need these regulatory frameworks to support this implementation of these mechanisms. But talking about congestion management specifically, this is a local problem, especially for DSOs. So from a European layer, we should have the push, we should have the urge, the accountability, and the macro guidelines. Then it is to the member states to foresee or to develop the most appropriate solutions And that, of course, could be overseen by the European regulation to see if these mechanisms are appropriate, to see if they are in line with the guidelines, if they are market-based, if they are transparent, if they are being implemented in the first place. Because also what we see in European regulation is, well, sometimes you have mandates for certain things to happen, but they take time, or they don't happen, or they don't happen completely. We still have net metering in some countries. So this is what I see for the European layer, the function of the European layer. But ultimately, I think that the solutions will be local or at least national.
Thank you very much. So I conclude my questions here. And if any of the supervisors would like to make any comment, like or not? No? Or any doctor here in the room would like to ask a question or a comment? No? Okay. So now, if you please could leave the room, we're going to have an internal deliberation about this thesis.